Hey there, good morning. Today, I want to talk about working with children who have experienced trauma. And one of the key skills that's really important to what I say kind of anchor your play therapy model to help facilitate that healing process for your clients. One of the questions I often hear when I'm working with people who are coming to my trainings or in my supervision, also known as consultation groups. I've been providing play therapy trainings and supervision for about 15 years now. And when it comes to trauma, these come up a lot. And I think they're really good questions. So I thought it would be helpful to talk about these in one of my weekly live stream episodes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And if you've watched any of my previous live stream episodes, one of the things you'll usually hear me say two things over and over and over. One is to ground your play therapy in a theoretical model because theory drives application. And how are you involving parents in the play therapy process? Because they ultimately are the therapeutic agents of change for their children. And so today I want to shift a little bit. And I remember years ago, this is years ago, probably about 13 years ago, I had a student who was a master's of counseling student. So she and I are still friends today. So I'm probably going to send this episode because I'm going to call her out, my friend Monica. I remember Monica and I were talking one time, and I was nerding out about play therapy theory and why you need play therapy theory. And it's really important about theory. And this is what I love about working with graduate students in the counseling or clinical social work programs, because they have this wonderful way of creating balance for me, which is when I'm like nerding out in one area, they're like, yeah, but what about this? And then I think about what they say and I'm like, oh yeah, that's really important as well. So I remember Monica saying to me, like, yeah, Kath, but don't forget to talk about relationship, because if it's all about theory, us students will do whatever you say and we'll just focus so much on theory. We'll miss the whole relationship thing. And I stopped for a minute and thought, and I laughed because I was like, oh, she's right again. So in honor of my friend Monica and those of you who are kind of nerdy like me and love working with kids, to me today, I want to kind of balance things out a bit with my weekly live stream kind of video podcast and talk a little bit about the balance, which is therapeutic use of self. And so therapeutic use of self is a core competency that the Association for Play Therapy has identified for play therapists to develop. And when we're talking about trauma, I think this is true for all play therapy. And when you're talking about children who have experienced trauma, that therapeutic use of self is really important. So that's what I want to talk about today. Let me first check in with those of you who are watching live. I would love to know who's here. So go ahead and post your name in the comments, post where you work, what population you work with. Do you work with children who have experienced trauma? What play therapy model are you using with children who experience trauma? I would say one of my default models is child-centered play therapy. And I would also say when I'm really being honest with myself, I'm probably more of a prescriptive play therapist. Um, and I love, 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 love integrating neuroscience and attachment theory in my case conceptualization of what's going on with my clients. So if you've attended any of my trainings in the past, and I do have a training coming up, play therapy with traumatized children and teens. I do have that coming up in September, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that I really like to do in my trainings is focus on having a way of conceptualizing the problem, because that is going to then influence your treatment planning process. And when it comes to trauma, I really feel like having that knowledge about neuroscience and what neuroscience over the last several decades has taught us about the impact of trauma and attachment issues on children, and using that and integrating that into the play therapy process. And in my mind, that's kind of case conceptualization for working with children with trauma. And so I really like to integrate those components in any of the trainings that I do. So that's also true for the training I have coming up in September about working with traumatized children, using that neuroscience and attachment lens to help children who have experienced trauma is really, really important. And you use that to ground your theory model and the application and the interventions you're using. That being said, we need to balance that out with therapeutic use of self and looking at the importance of that and how to do that and why to do that from a neuroscience and attachment theory lens gives us a lot of good information. And so if you're watching live, go ahead, post your name in the comments. I would love to see who's here. Where do you work? What population do you work with? So I'm Kathy Spooner. I go live every Wednesday at 7 a.m. Pacific time. I go live in my Facebook group, Play and Expressive Arts Therapy Playground. I go live on LinkedIn, and I go live on my YouTube channel, as well as I also go live in Instagram. And so if you're interested in my Facebook group and you're on Facebook, it's a group for mental health professionals using play therapy and expressive arts. And if pop over there to my Facebook group. You have to answer all of the questions or you won't be able to get into the group. You can find any of my replays pretty easily in my Facebook group in the featured section. If you're not on Facebook and you're not a Facebook fan, that's cool too, because you can always pop over to my YouTube channel, click on the live tab, and all the replays are there. You can watch any of those. On Instagram, you can probably go over to my grid. It's probably easiest, though, to find them on my YouTube channel, so you might want to pop over there. So let me just check in with a couple of people who are here. So we have Robert, who is an LCSW, working as a clinician at Youth Consultation Services, work with youth with developmental disability. Well, when my mouth works today, working with youths with developmental disabilities and those who've experienced trauma. You know what, Robert, that is such a needed area when you are working with that population, is how do you help them overcome the impact of trauma, especially depending on some of the developmental disabilities and how that shows up. And my previous background prior to becoming a licensed clinical social worker is I was a special education teacher, and I taught children with emotional problems, but I spent many a summer while I was in my bachelor's degree program working in therapeutic recreation programs. So we had children, youth, and adults with a variety of challenges, developmental disabilities. And what I found is I think play therapy in expressive arts is a really helpful way to um, facilitate that healing process for that population. So that's awesome. So we also have Steph. Hey, Steph, how are you? Steph is in my Play Therapy Academy. And she is also kind of a neighbor here, not neighbor for real, but we're kind of town neighbors. I'm about an hour and a half outside of Las Vegas. So welcome, Steph. It's so good that you're here. I always like seeing you here. So, alrighty, let's get started. So, first thing, feel free to ask questions along the way. Love your input. That's the nice thing about going live is that you can interact. If you're watching on the replay, honestly, feel free to post questions in the comments. I do monitor things after the broadcast ends, so feel free to post afterwards. So first and foremost, one key thing that I want to talk about is when we say therapeutic use of self in the mental health world, what the heck does that mean? And what is therapeutic use of self in play therapy? We were actually talking about this a bit in one of my Play Therapy Academy consultation groups, which when you're talking about play therapy and that therapeutic use of self, there's usually that ethics component that goes along with it as well, like that therapeutic use of self. It's a professional relationship, making sure we maintain professional boundaries. And when you're talking about working with children, maybe even adolescents, but definitely children, I haven't found it as much what I'm about to say with adolescents as much as I have talking about working with children, play therapy with children. And that is the therapeutic use of self and touch. So are we allowed to have physical contact with our clients, our child clients? Sometimes they want a hug. Should we say no? So that whole issue of touch, if you're interested in reading more about that, because I'm not going to touch on that too much in this episode, that the Association for Play Therapy has a white paper on use of touch in play therapy. So if you want to read it, they give some really good guidance on that. And in a nutshell, it's essentially we have to make sure, like any other boundary in the mental health profession, is whose benefit? Is it the client's benefit or is it the child's benefit? And sometimes kids want to give you a hug. And if they want to give me a hug, I will give them a hug. I have had adult clients who want to give me a hug, and I will give them a hug because it has everything to do with therapeutic use of self, in my opinion. So, what is therapeutic use of self? Essentially, the way that I think about therapeutic use of self in play therapy in mental health is to think about the therapeutic relationship. So yes, the treatment process is grounded in theory. Theory drives application. If you're using an integrated approach and you consider yourself to be eclectic or integrative, you still want to make sure that your interventions and the approach that you're taking have a theoretical foundation to them and how you're showing up in the playroom. Within that context is how you show up with your clients in the playroom. And this is therapeutic use of self. It's that relationship. While it is a therapeutic relationship, it is a professional relationship, it is a relationship. And we want to show up person to person in that professional capacity. And I remember one time, not one time, but I remember when I was at the living in Virginia, and I was pretty active in the Virginia Association for Play Therapy. And I'm gonna call out to Ann Stewart. If you're in the Association for Play Therapy and you've had an opportunity to interact with her, she's awesome. But one of the things I loved about her approach was she kind of took that heart to heart approach, and she would often say, "From my heart to yours." Um, and that's, I mean, I love that way of thinking about it. We show up that way in the play therapy process. We understand that it's therapeutic, we understand that it's professional. And so I show up as the Kathy Spooner version of a play therapist in the playroom. You're like Steph, you're going to show up as the Steph version of play therapist in the play therapy playroom. So, so you're going to show up as your version in the playroom. You're going to connect relationship to relationship. And we also know from neuroscience, and here's the other benefit of that therapeutic use of self. We also know from neuroscience and the work of Daniel Siegel what he calls resonance circuits. And resonance circuits are essentially that circuitry that helps us to tune in, even physiologically, with our clients, to be attuned with them. And if you're interested in that topic, I've talked about that in previous live streams as well. That whole neuroscience kind of circuitry. I go into a lot more detail about this in play therapy trainings that I do, outside of the Getting Grounded in Play Therapy series. The other trainings that I do are pretty much based on neuroscience and what attachment theory has to teach us. And so what we know is these resonance circuits help us tune in. And as we're tuned in, that gives us some information about um, clients' emotions, reading their cues, what's going on with them, the pacing of the sessions. Are we going too fast? Are we going too slow? Are we tuned in? Are we kind of matching their emotions in the moment to help do that co-regulation throughout the play therapy session? If we're tuned in and we're using ourselves therapeutically, it gives us a lot of information how to structure that play therapy session in order for it to be beneficial for our clients. This also includes parents or caregivers. We need to make sure that we're building that therapeutic relationship with parents, caregivers, foster parents. If we're allowed to work with foster parents, that usually depends on what's going on with the child's case. And I always make sure to check in with the foster care social worker to find out what extent I can have contact with the foster parent and provide support. Sometimes they don't let that happen for a variety of reasons. And we need to build those relationships to give support to them, because clients are only with us 45 minutes to an hour once a week. All the other times that adult in their life is helping them navigate life and whatever challenges are going on with them. And so building that rapport with parents or guardians or caregivers also helps us to support the parents so that they can support their child. So we want to show up in sessions therapeutically with these caregivers just as much as we want to show up with with the child that way. So that's a really important part of the process as well. And so we have Sharon joining us. Sharon Ann, welcome from LinkedIn. Sharon Ann said, I spent 10 years working in the mental health system as a professional temp. That's interesting. And now transitioned to a trauma coach. I mostly work with individuals battling anxiety, PTSD, depression, and dissociative disorders. That's awesome. I um, I actually think like the coaching aspect of trauma work is really important, like parent coaching, coaching clients. I think there are things that coaches can do who are trained and knowledgeable and kind of grounded in a coaching framework that can be really beneficial to teach the skills. Trauma makes people feel like they're crazy, and it can be really destabilizing, even for kids. And the way that that shows up for kids is dysregulation, some behaviors that don't make any sense. It can be really distressing. And so, being able to provide support to parents in that process of healing for their kids is really important as well, I think. Um, in play therapy, we want to make sure as we're showing up therapeutically in sessions, we also want to make sure we're showing up therapeutically with our the caregivers as well. And so that brings me to the next thing, which is creating that safe environment for trauma healing. And so we know from polyvagal theory and what neuroscience has taught us over like the last 30 years that children need to feel safe in order to engage their social engagement circuits. They cannot engage in the play process until their social engagement circuits are activated, which means that threat circuitry has to be deactivated. And one of the things that I think is really awesome about the work of Stephen Porges with polyvagal theory is understanding the activation of social engagement circuits is what helps children to recognize play as safe versus as a threat. And if you have children, and maybe your children are young, and I have two boys. I grew up with two brothers. They can be playing, and I don't know. I think this is a thing. I remember watching, like dogs. We have dogs too. When they're puppies, they're playing, and then they can instantly turn to growling, which I remember my brothers oftentimes would be wrestling on the floor, playing and laughing, and the next minute they would be punching and yelling at each other. Um, these things occurred with my children, not the punching part, but the yelling and screaming part when my boys were really little. And so, what's the difference? They're playing. Well, it's the difference between activation of social engagement circuits, creating that sense of safety, queuing up, things are safe, versus threat activation. And so when you're working with children who have experienced trauma, their circuitry has been impacted by trauma. So they're going to be extra sensitive to threat responses because they've had that traumatic experience. And so when you're working with children and adolescents who've experienced trauma, it's really important to use that therapeutic use of self for that tuning into your resonant circuitry so you can make sure you're reading cues and using that to create that environment of safety, because they're not going to be able to engage in the healing process. They're not going to be able to use the play therapy process or access those therapeutic powers of play until they feel safe. And so the other thing you need to think about when you're creating that environment of safety for healing is parents need to feel safe as well. I often find that parents have been traumatized by the situation as well. And oftentimes, we often have parents who have a history of trauma that's not fully healed, and then their children experience trauma, and sometimes the child's trauma can activate the parents' trauma triggers, and then that destabilizes the child. So I really find that it's important for creating that sense of safety for parents as well. So when you're having those parenting sessions, you can help them learn some skills and create that safe environment for their children at home. And I find that's just as important to build that relationship with parents. And then the third thing to think about, and here we get to the skills. So what are the 3 skills? So that's the context where it's that therapeutic use of self and creating that safe environment. And you can do that by, these are 3 essential skills that are part of the competencies for play therapy. So the Association for Play Therapy here in the United States has identified core competencies that play therapists need to develop and become effective using. And one of those core competencies is developing relationship and rapport building skills. And they've identified these 3 elements as critical for that rapport building and that therapeutic use of self. And so the first one is empathy. Empathy is really about creating that compassionate space, not just by being sympathetic. It's not just that sympathy. Okay, full disclosure here. I was thinking my dog would stop. So if you hear this weird digging in the background, Luna, come here. Luna, usually it's Lily digging, but she's laying under my feet. So now Luna, my dog Luna, has been digging. I don't know why she digs. She feels the need to dig. So if you hear this weird digging in the background, it's my dog Luna. And I'm really hoping she doesn't go outside. I mean, doesn't go to the window and start barking at the neighbors, warning them off. Her threat circuit's activated as she's guarding the people she loves and the people who love her. I don't know that our neighbors fully enjoy the experience of Luna's threat circuits being activated. But anyway, so, okay, Luna's now laying down, so we're good. Hopefully that will last. So the skills that are needed first and foremost for using that therapeutic use of self, creating that environment, and doing that rapport building, first and foremost, is empathy. So empathy is not the same of sympathy. And the way that I think about empathy is understanding the depth of the painful experience and being able to hold that pain. So, and this is key because we're using ourself. So we're activating heart to heart, right? We're activating neurocircuitry. We're picking up on all those emotions. And holding that can be challenging sometimes, not to mention exhausting by the end of the day. So it's really important to do your self-care and make sure you have a way to kind of disconnect and shake that off from the day. Sometimes it's easier some days than others. And to be able to be effective with that therapeutic use of self and engaging empathy, we're connecting circuitry to circuitry using our therapeutic use of self. We're recognizing all of those emotions. We're recognizing the pain and we're holding that, and we're showing up in a compassionate way while also maintaining those boundaries. And that's the trick. That is a learned skill along the way. We get better at it as we go along. And good supervision and consultation is key to being able to do that. We'll often talk about those things in my play therapy supervision groups as well, kind of helping people decompress and get support and kind of shake off some of the yuck of the work that we do so that we could go back in and do it again, showing up compassionately with empathy. And the second skill is that ability to create safety within the therapeutic relationship. And this is where I like to use there's a circle of security model for working with children that's grounded in attachment theory. And in the circle of security model, they teach parents to be bigger, wiser, stronger, and kind. And so within that therapeutic relationship, we are creating that safe space where we're following along, and then sometimes we have to take charge. And so, whenever possible, follow, whenever necessary, lead. And we want to do that in a compassionate way and create that sense of safety, because we also know that our clients are looking to us for a way to work through this. They're looking for us, and for lack of a better way of saying it, some of that leadership ability, some of that co-regulation through the process to create that structure in a compassionate and empathetic way. So we need to make sure that we're kind of knowing when we need to lead and knowing when we need to follow. When do we connect? When do we kind of move things in a different way and make suggestions? Because we need to maintain that safety within the therapeutic space. So sometimes that means that we need to kind of shift the focus in the playroom to do something else. But sometimes we need to slow the pace down. Sometimes we need to shift gears. Sometimes we need to set therapeutic limits. Creating that safe space is really important, and using the relationship in order to do that can be very effective. This is also true with parents, so we want to make sure to do this with parents as well. And then the final skill that's identified with the Association for Play Therapy, with these core competencies on using the relationship and building rapport, is unconditional positive regard. And as somebody who is trained, I would say my default mode is child-centered play therapy. That's one of the key elements of child-centered play therapy, is that unconditional positive regard for the child, that I create that safe and healing space, because in here, the child knows that they're valued, they're accepted, not always their behavior. The child themselves is seen and valued. And this is a place where they can try out things and be who they are and work through things that are unpleasant in their life. And they're not going to be judged, and nobody's going to tell them what to do. This is, I mean, think about it. When you're struggling and you're having a hard time, and you go to your friend, or you go to your partner, or I don't know, you go to your parents sometimes, sometimes you just need to know that you're seen and heard and valued and loved. That in itself is a healing part of the play therapy process. And so creating that sense of unconditional positive regard for your client is what I would say one of the key things necessary to have a very strong therapeutic rapport, because that rapport that you have with your clients is like the secret sauce that anchors your play therapy model and helps your child, your client, their parents work through all of the stages of the change process. And so that is it for today. Let me just do a quick recap on what we talked about today. The first thing is really understanding that therapeutic use of self in the play therapy process is a really important skill to master in play therapy, especially when you are working with children who've experienced trauma. It's like the secret sauce that anchors your play therapy model and allows your client to engage in that deep work of healing. The second thing is really making sure you're creating that safe environment for healing of trauma, because children are not going to be able to engage those social engagement circuits until their threat circuitry has been disengaged. So the first thing you're doing in the play therapy process is really establishing that safe space. And then throughout the change process, or throughout all those stages of change and the different tasks that have to be accomplished along the way, you are maintaining that safe space for your client. And then the third thing is the skills that are needed in order to build a strong therapeutic relationship and build that rapport and show up in a way that you are demonstrating that therapeutic use of self are empathy, safety, and unconditional positive regard. These are what really anchor your play therapy model. This is what anchors the treatment process, the play therapy process, because you've created that safe space, that place of trust, that place of unconditional positive regard, so that your client feels safe to do that really hard work of healing. So Robert says, thank you so much. I was glad you're able to come. So if you're interested, I do have a live webinar coming up. It is called Play Therapy with Traumatized Children and Teens. It's a live webinar, so it's really interactive. In this webinar, I do that case conceptualization of grounding in neuroscience and attachment theory, and then we take that information and how does it use it for that treatment planning process. What do you have to do in each phase of the treatment process? We do a lot of play therapy interventions, what kind of interventions you can use in each stage of the play therapy change process, and lots of interaction, lots of support from your colleagues. We do the breakout rooms, which I find those to be really useful, and sharing ideas with each other. So if you're interested, the live webinar is coming up in September. It'll be on Saturday, September 16th. You can pop over to my website at rhplaytherapytraining.com. You can go over to the courses page and then scroll down until you see the courses. There are 2 registration versions. There's a registration that includes the continuing education hours. If you're looking for those CEs, you want to make sure to check that registration. If you don't need the continuing education hours, then there is a less expensive version for the live webinar for those of you who don't really need the CEs. It was my way of kind of helping to accommodate that. So make sure you kind of pick which one fits your fits your needs, really. So thanks, Robert. Robert said I can share this event with my team. Awesome. Thank you, Robert. And if you have any questions about the training or Play Therapy Academy, I didn't really talk much about that this time. If you're interested in play therapy consultation and supervision, you can pop over to my website on the supervision page. If you have any questions, honestly, please feel free to reach out, send me a message, or probably a message, leave a comment, tag me in the comment. So Kathy says, this was very good. Psychiatric provider for children and adolescents. Awesome. Thank you, Kathy, for attending. And I will see all of you next week. Bye for now.